Hi, I'm Ashley Lawson from West Virginia Wesleyan College, and I'll be sharing a presentation today on film adaptations of Shirley Jackson's work and what they can tell us about Jackson's writing more generally. Jackson fans and scholars have lately had the pleasure or the affliction, depending on your personal view, of living through a revival of dramatic interest in the author. Though three of her novels and one short story were adapted in at least 8 different instances for stage and screen during her lifetime, her body of work received only scattered interest in Hollywood after Jackson's death in 1965. That has changed of late. A feature film adaptation of her novella, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, was released in 2018, and it was accompanied that same year by a Netflix riff on The Haunting of Hill House. Even more recently, a film version of the novelization of Jackson's life, Shirley, premiered on Hulu last year, and we can look forward to or dread a feature-length version of The Lottery that's reported to be forthcoming. The Haunting of Hill House has been the most adapted of Jackson's work, and the uncanny recurrence of these adaptations seems fitting for a writer who so skillfully utilized Gothic conventions. It is worth asking, though, why, after decades of relative silence, this spate of Jackson adaptations is happening now. My theory is that this new wave is likely the result of 2 different factors. The first is the resurgence in interest in Jackson's life and career during an era when we are also hungry to see intriguing and complicated female characters on the screen. Second, and perhaps even more importantly, is the voracious appetite for new content that has resulted from rapidly multiplying digital streaming platforms, many of which are attempting to establish themselves through original prestige-seeking productions. And what better way is there to borrow respect than by associating yourself with a beloved canonical author? As gratifying as this return to Jackson's oeuvre for source material may be for those of us who are willing to see it as a validation of her life's work, I will argue that recent productions have also brought to light a challenge faced not only by the adapters of Jackson's writing, but one which also plagues many book to stage or screen productions more generally. Specifically, these adaptations demonstrate the way that inherently visual productions are tempted to clarify elements that were left deliberately vague or abstract in their literary source material. Such a shift can risk ruining one of the most important elements of Jackson's distinctive approach, the reader's participation in filling in the nature of the threat at hand. To understand where we are now, it will help to know a bit of the history of adaptations of Jackson's work. As I previously mentioned, many of her novels and short stories drew interest for dramatic adaptations almost immediately upon publication. This, unfortunately, was ultimately Jackson's only connection to Hollywood, as she turned down an offer from fellow author Roald Dahl to write for television, and a tentative project that tapped Jackson to script a biopic of dancer Isadora Duncan's life lost steam after a tentative start. The earliest adaptations of her story, The Lottery, an NBC radio production and a cameo theater TV version, both came out in 1951, 3 years after this shocking little story caused a public scandal when it appeared in the New Yorker magazine. And the publicity related to that backlash is likely at least partly to blame for producers' interest in the piece, though the story's allegorical resonance during the Cold War was probably another draw. The first feature film adaptation of Jackson's work was the 1957 movie Lizzie, based on her 1954 novel The Bird's Nest, about a young woman's struggle with multiple personalities. Jackson's own response to Lizzie, as reported in a letter to her parents, was somewhat tepid. I actually don't remember a thing about it. I saw my name on the screen and then I think I closed my eyes and kept them closed. She also complained about the film's poor understanding of the field of psychology, a facet of the book which she had studiously and thoroughly versed herself before writing, and the desecration of her original dialogue. Though in another earlier letter, she admits that as long as the film producers keep sending her those checks, she will be willing to tolerate almost anything. Though Jackson may have been less than thrilled with the final product, in the end, her opinion did not matter. The film was overlooked when another, more successful production about multiple personalities, The Three Faces of Eve, coincidentally arrived in theaters that same year to greater publicity and acclaim, winning its lead actress, Joanne Woodward, an Oscar. In 1963, a more successful attempt to transition Jackson's work to Hollywood hit movie screens across the country. The Haunting was directed with both respect and daring by Robert Wise, who was fresh off the success of his film West Side Story, and the achievement of this adaptation may have been, in part, because of the director's affection for the source material. After reading a review of the novel in Time magazine, Wise got a hold of a copy and was so enthralled with the book that he started and nearly fell out of his chair when an assistant knocked on his office door during one of his reading sessions. Perhaps thanks to his background working with trailblazing low-budget horror director Val Lewton, Wise had an appreciation for Jackson's ability to titillate the reader with abstract ideas rather than the usual haunted house theatrics. In an interview during the promotion for the film, Wise demonstrated his capable understanding of the author's technique by declaring, Shirley Jackson writes along that very fine line, just on the edge of reality and unreality, and you're never quite sure which is which. I tried to follow that same line. Despite Wise's respectful, sensitive approach to his source material, Jackson again had mixed reactions to this adaptation. In an interview with her local Vermont newspaper after seeing the film, Jackson happily reported, "They didn't change my book. I think they have done a tremendous job. I wrote a ghost story, and the film is a ghost story. They have retained the atmosphere while interpreting it from the printed word world to the screen. That's no mean achievement." She concluded by admitting, "When I saw it, I was terrified. I couldn't believe that I had written this. Mr. Wise took me out of myself as I watched the movie." But in a letter to her parents from September 1963, she gave the film a more mixed review. "We saw the movie of The Haunting in New York at a special preview. It is actually a very poor movie. The plot of the book changed radically and far too much talk. But there are a couple of terribly frightening scenes in it and a lot of exciting camera work. Stanley and I were both really scared, and the house is wonderful." In a letter to her friend in October, she elaborates on her criticism, calling the film quite talky, and admits that when she took the elder of her sons to see it in a theater, that she nearly fell asleep. In her trademark sardonic style, she declared, "The scariest part of the whole thing the second time was the parking ticket I got while I was in the movie." In general, Jackson regarded Hollywood's interest in her work with bemusement. In a letter from 1955, around the time the movie Lizzie was being made, she described a surprisingly touching note she received from the screenwriter Jerry Wald, in which he explained what he believed should be a symbiotic relationship between films and literature, and then asked the author to send along any other material she might have that could be adapted. Though Jackson cheekily reports sending along a long narrative poem on the landing of the Pilgrims, which I wrote in high school, to which apparently she received no response. In general, Jackson was more than happy to take Hollywood's money and generally appreciated the respectful, even adoring way she was treated by the studios and their employees, but she never felt the final product of these relationships lived up to her own work. The inherent challenges of adapting Jackson's work, of course, have not stopped Hollywood from trying to do so. The popularity of adaptations of The Haunting of Hill House might stem from its use of the recognizable haunted house trope. Indeed, from Amityville Horror to The Shining, the haunted house subgenre has produced some of the most popular and successful horror films of all time. Yet Jackson's novel, itself considered a classic of the genre, is in some ways atypical, in that much of the apprehension produced by the book comes from what is not shown and what is not explained. Not a single ghost makes an appearance. Rather, a series of eerie and inexplicable phenomena target the protagonist, Eleanor Vance, sending this already unstable young woman completely over the edge. The drama of the plot is based in Eleanor's psychological unraveling, more so or at least equal to the mystery of the supernatural events that manifest in Hill House. Indeed, part of what makes Jackson's novel such an influential example of this genre is the author's restraint. By its final pages, readers may realize that we have misunderstood the book's title. The house is not subject to haunting, but rather is the source of these very events. Variously described as not sane, a place of despair, and not a fit place for people or for love or for hope, the house has absorbed the unhappiness and ill will of its inhabitants, and it turns that suffering back on anyone foolish enough to spend a night under its roof. Though there are some genuinely chilling moments in the book, the more interesting tension is to be found in the characters' reactions and in their relationships with one another. The unsuspecting band of visitors, all brought to the house by the dubious yet ultimately benign Dr. Montague in order to both provoke and to study its rumored phenomena, are subject to moments of terror from which they usually recover in the more lucid light of day. The exception to this pattern is, of course, Eleanor, who is so desperate for a home and a sense of belonging that she's willing to accept even this diseased and dangerous lodging as her destiny. By the end of the book, Eleanor, due to her instability, is sent away by the pseudoscientist / father figure / love interest who brought them all there, but she's so reluctant to leave that she, or the house, Jackson is careful to leave room for both interpretations, drives her car into a tree and dies. Her death is the only permanent effect of the haunting, but it is also attributable to her unbalanced mental state that she brought with her to the house, depending on readers' interpretation. Filmmakers who wish to adapt Jackson's both subtle and dramatic novel must therefore make a choice: either follow Jackson's lead and refrain from overt depictions of ghosts, or fill in the gaps she so carefully placed throughout the story. The various adaptations of the novel show the resulting effects of these two divergent paths. Wise's 1963 version admirably respects and mimics Jackson's self-restraint. The scenes depicting supernatural events are pulled straight from the novel. Loud noises torture Eleanor and the other female participant, Theodora, in the middle of the night, but then disappear when their male companions come within range. The message, "Come home, Eleanor," is written in red chalk on a hallway wall with no explanation for its authorship. A bedroom door bends with some supernatural energy, but the source of the disturbance is not revealed. The only significant change made to the supernatural events is in the film's rendering of that final scene. As Eleanor drives away from the house, some unseen force takes over the steering wheel and drives her directly into a tree, as Eleanor looks on in horror. The film thereby rules out the possible suicide explanation and gives one final confirmation of the paranormal, but it does so without diminishing our protagonist's character development. One reason that the adaptation used so close to the original text might be because it was written and filmed with Jackson's blessing and some limited input. Wise and screenwriter Nelson Gidding did change some details of the book, including small and inexplicable name revisions. Eleanor Vance becomes Eleanor Lance, and Dr. Montague is now Dr. Markway. The object of Eleanor's romantic fantasies shift from Luke to the doctor, and thus when the latter's wife appears, she is a more direct threat to Eleanor's desire to make her dreams a reality. Yet these changes ultimately have only minor effects on the plot and little impact on the larger meaning of the film. In contrast, the 1999 adaptation, produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Jan de Bont, chooses excess over restraint and suffers for it. Many critics of the day labeled the movie a remake of Wise's film rather than an adaptation of Jackson's novel, which aptly represents this version's level of remove from the original text. The film's divergent approaches affect not only how the filmmakers tell their respective stories, but indeed which story they tell. De Bont's more heavy-handed visual approach corresponds with significant alterations to the basic plot. For example, the doctor figure is made more sinister. He tricks the participants into believing they are coming to Hill House for an insomnia study, and his reluctance to end the experiment even after things begin to go horribly wrong puts him into a secondary villain role reminiscent of the long tradition of evil scientist characters throughout film history, though he eventually reforms. More importantly, the filmmakers took full advantage of the developing CGI technology of the era to craft a series of visually impressive paranormal events, yet these additions create an effect that one movie critic dubbed eye candy with a hollow center. To justify showing off this visual bag of visual tricks, the film alters Jackson's backstory to make it more sinister and more overtly moralistic. The original owner of the house, Hugh Crane, is no longer Jackson's and Wise's strict patriarch who has been beset by an excessive amount of personal loss and misfortune. He is now a robber baron child trafficker who enslaved kids in the house, though for what nefarious purpose is never really revealed. The ghosts of the children reach out to the empathetic Eleanor more so than the other characters, and her psychological unraveling is connected to their increasingly desperate pleas for help. While the film pays tribute to some of the same supernatural scenes from the earlier versions, it uses its CGI muscle to take them to more explicit and yet ultimately, I would argue, less affecting extremes. In part, that's because the film carefully answers any and all questions about the cause of the haunting of Hill House. This is a house filled with ghosts, and we are shown quite a few, including the malevolent super ghost of Hugh Crane, who in the final climactic scenes materializes out of his portrait and attempts to finish off his human guests. And Eleanor is further implicated in this backstory when she realizes that, surprise, Crane's wife is in fact her great-great-grandmother. Thus, instead of Jackson's and Wise's emotionally unstable protagonist, we are given a heroine whose emotional instability was but a temporary phase in the fated path that has brought her to face and repent for her extended family's evil legacy. This revision of the story's paranormal focus corresponds with an even more significant change to the depiction of the character of Eleanor. Wise's Eleanor, played with masterful restraint by Julie Harris, is a skillful case study of a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. In the 1999 version, Lily Taylor's Eleanor is still mentally unstable, sheltered, and desperate for connection, but instead of devolving into madness at the house's insistent prodding, this Eleanor rises to the challenge before her and transforms into a kind of ad hoc warrior queen. At the same time, any hint of her attraction to the male inhabitants of the household is overshadowed when she steps up to take the masculine role of protector. Were we to give the filmmakers the benefit of the doubt, we might try to interpret this revision as an attempt to change with the times and acknowledge feminist criticisms of Hollywood's tired overuse of the damsel in distress trope. But the 1999 Eleanor's sudden transformation is couched as a kind of maternal super urge that is a byproduct of her own childlessness. It also runs completely counter to Jackson's original intentions for her character. Her Eleanor suffers from a lack of agency and an uncertainty of identity. The message of de Bont's film seems to be that Eleanor was always strong. She simply needed the right instigator to bring out her fighting spirit. It is difficult then to extrapolate any kind of subtext from this revised storyline beyond a facile girl power platitude about women's inherent strength. The filmmaker's decision to confirm and even explain away the paranormal source of the events that occur within the house departs significantly from Jackson's approach. And this choice is important because it reflects the primary point of difference between so many cinematic adaptations, especially those from the Gothic, suspense, and horror genres, and their source material. Though critic Bruce F. Cowan argues that one of the advantages of the horror film in comparison to horror tales in literature is that it can show the monster or whatever parts of the story can be rendered as images, whether this is truly an improvement likely depends on the preference of the viewer or the reader, as well as the source material's intentions. Indeed, even Cowan acknowledges that horror literature may have the advantage in imaginative or abstract power, like invoking disembodied fear. Jackson was well aware of the power of abstraction, both in terms of its unsettling effect on the reader, but also its ability to support the larger thematic concerns of a literary text. And when radio, film, and television producers began to express interest in her work, she foresaw both the potential benefits and challenges of translating her effects to a visual medium. In a June 1951 letter she wrote to a potential collaborator, she asked, "As you know, I have a great interest in the almost supernatural and the sort of dreamlike plot. Would you think that any such would work out? I think that television would be an amazing medium for such effects. What do you think? I am, as I say, excited by the whole idea and hope that we can work out something together." She goes on to debate the merits of substituting action for internal dialogue versus making thoughts audible, and she seems excited by the way a fluid sense of time could be expressed. And though she suggests that they ought to avoid the arty and experimental thing as much as possible, she also states, "I do not know the extent to which a camera may be manipulated in a television program, or in anything for that matter. My work has always been directly with a typewriter and a sheet of paper. But it seems to me that the imaginative camera work could do as much as anything to create the effects of indecision and fear." She concludes by admitting, "These are, of course, only timid attempts to discover what possibilities there might be in a substitution of television for fiction. I see stories as in paragraphs and pages and find it bewildering but fascinating to try to translate them into pictures." As a woman who clearly believed in her art and its power, she seemed both excited and skeptical about filling in the visual aspects of these mediums. Indeed, critic Jack Sullivan describes the challenge of adapting Jackson's methods well. Reversing M.R. James's dictum that a ghost story should leave a narrow loophole for natural explanation, Jackson wrote stories of psychological anguish that leave a loophole for supernatural explanation. This is why I believe Jackson's texts endure. That abstraction allows us to fill in our own contemporary fears, our own ghosts. In contrast, de Bont and his crew obliterate any and all loopholes, preferring instead to plug every available gap with the most elaborate special effects, seemingly just because they can. As Stephen King noted in his 1981 book of theory, Danse Macabre, if horror movies have any redeeming social merit, it is because of their ability to form liaisons between the real and the unreal, to provide subtext. Thus, while the momentary catharsis that can be provided by these films should not be discounted, what Jackson understood so well is that the fleeting discomfort of a cheap scare is nothing when compared to the lingering unease of an abstract and ambiguous menace. These genres are ultimately more unsettling and affecting when the reader's apprehension lingers beyond the final page. While de Bont's approach may seem to want to simply make that subtext even more explicit by attributing its haunting to historical injustice, his moralistic subplot is overshadowed by an obvious adoration for his bag of CGI tricks. By opting for an approach that Pam Kesey astutely describes in her assessment of this film as one that focuses so much attention on the technology of the effect and not the effect of the technology, the backstory about oppression feels like a slapdash justification to include some creepy images of suffering children, which is, of course, a common trope of the horror genre. In contrast, Jackson's more abstract approach emphasizes both the paranormal activity as well as its effects on her characters. When the book and the 1963 film finish with the same passage of text with which they both open, that ominous declaration that whatever walked in Hill House walked alone, we are left with an uneasy sense that the threat persists and that any of us may stumble unsuspecting into our own Hill House. In contrast, when de Bont's Eleanor sacrifices her life to release the souls of the abused children, we understand that the danger has been terminated, and we are presumably supposed to leave the movie theater comforted by the feeling that moral order has been restored, an effect that Stephen King has appropriately identified as innately conservative, even reactionary effect of the horror genre. It is worth noting that the fault of this ending may lie with the studio, not the director. DreamWorks decided that de Bont's original ending lacked clarity and that they sent the director back for reshoots of a new ending written by a different screenwriter, which I guess provides clarity of a sort. The 2018 Netflix series restores Jackson's original title, but it adheres to a guiding ethos that is more similar to the 1999 film. This version focuses on a biological nuclear family named the Cranes who moved into the titular house in order to restore and sell it. It is both a cautionary tale for our HGTV mad age, as well as a family drama that I believe only somewhat successfully explores sibling bonds and the legacy of trauma. But even with the expanded canvas of 10 episodes, each just under an hour long, the series struggles under the weight of balancing its own heavy expectations with those of Jackson's source text. Jackson fans who press play on episode 1 will realize quickly that this series, despite using the original title, is less an adaptation and more of an homage, or depending on your view, an appropriation. The changes made to the central cast are jarring. By loosely merging the novel's backstory and its present tense, the series confuses the original chronology. Names from the novel are distributed willy-nilly among the characters. The youngest children in the show are a pair of twins named Eleanor, who usually goes by the nickname from the book Nell, and Luke, who is a sometimes love interest for Eleanor in Jackson's version. Another sibling who shares her predecessor's psychic abilities is Theodora, and the father takes the book's patriarch Hugh's name. The remaining siblings are tributes to the show's godparents. The oldest daughter is Shirley, and her older brother is named Stephen, named after Spielberg, who produced the 1999 film and brought the material to showrunner Mike Flanagan. Dr. Montague becomes a psychiatrist that the adult Nell sees, and the secondary character Arthur is given the original Eleanor's last name Vance and becomes this version of the character's love interest, which restores to that character the name Eleanor Vance once she is married. Only Mr. and Mrs. Dudley, the house's caretakers, retain their names in their original roles, though they now have a daughter named Abigail, who is one of Hugh Crane's oppressed daughters in the book. The effect of these haphazard revisions is disorienting on viewers who had any experience with prior iterations. More importantly, I've gone into such detail about these changes because I think it reflects the creator's misguided attempt to pay tribute to the source material while completely misunderstanding the original text's purpose. The series does do a better job than the more recent film with utilizing ghosts to build a genuinely suspenseful narrative. In fact, in this version, literal and metaphorical ghosts seem to be the whole point. The most prominent poltergeist is an original creation, the bent neck lady, which plagues Nell from her first night in the house through adulthood. In episode 5, it is revealed, spoiler alert, that the identity of the ghost is actually Nell herself after she died by suicide during her first adult return to visit the house. Flanagan calls the bent neck lady reveal the heart of his entire pitch for the show. And indeed, this twist is the first hint of what will become the show's ultimate explanation for Hill House's hauntings. Those who die in the house are doomed to remain trapped there, making the structure a kind of purgatory to which the living family members can both symbolically and literally return to face their personal demons. This is where the show tries to achieve social relevance by bestowing upon each character a particular personal burden that must be overcome. Stephen sold his family out by writing about their experience in order to jumpstart his career as an author, though he remained skeptical about what actually happened during their brief time there. Shirley, angry and righteous, becomes a mortician because she is convinced that she can solve death. The queer undertones of the book are made overt in this Theo's lesbian identity, but it is her extrasensory empathetic abilities that cause her to wall herself off physically by wearing gloves and emotionally by limiting her dating life to a series of one-night stands. Nell and Luke, who were the last to see their mother before she died and who were always the most susceptible to the house's powers, each struggle with a different form of mental and physical illness. Nell suffers from sleep paralysis, and Luke is a heroin addict. The father, Hugh, tries to protect his children by refusing to tell them what really happened to their mother, who died in the house, and his repression manifests in visions of his wife that only he can see. Each family member therefore clearly represents a different coping mechanism with grief, and the show seems to imply that haunting is merely a metaphor for the traumas of normal life. It also allows for these issues to be resolved all too easily once they return to Hill House to confront their past in the final 2 episodes. And this really is probably the show's biggest misappropriation of Jackson's text. Part of this series' attempt at homage is the way that Jackson's original language has been chopped up and lightly sprinkled like a bland seasoning salt throughout the episodes. Mrs. Dudley's famous "in the night and the dark" speech remains more or less the same. She also gets, for some reason, to give Eleanor's reader favorite "cup of stars" speech. The young Theo has a chilling "whose hand was I holding" experience that comes directly from the book, but the show's use of the novel's opening and closing paragraph is the most direct and literal transference, and even small tweaks make a huge difference to the original meaning. The novel opens and closes with more or less the same paragraph. No living organism can continue for long to exist sanely under the conditions of absolute reality. Hill House, not stained, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. In the series, episode 1 opens with a voiceover narration that is taken directly from Jackson's text, though now Hill House has stood for 100 years since my family moved in, immediately making this a story that centers not on the house, but the family's experience in it. The use of this paragraph at the end of the final episode changes it more drastically. Just prior, Stephen is reconciled with his estranged wife and declares, "My only wish is to come home." And thus, coming home becomes a central metaphor for confronting one's past and finding closure. The final narration begins with another excerpt from the book, Dr. Montague's declaration in the novel that fear is the relinquishment of logic, but then it swerves to take an entirely different course. Fear is the relinquishment of logic, the willing relinquishment of reasonable patterns. But so, it seems, is love. Love is the relinquishment of logic, the willing relinquishing of reasonable patterns. We yield to it or we fight it. We cannot meet it halfway. Without it, we cannot continue to exist long sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Hill House, not sane, stands against its hills, holding darkness within. It has stood so for 100 years, and it might stand for 100 more. Within, walls continue upright, bricks meet neatly, floors are firm, and doors are sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and those who walk there walk together. The show therefore proposes love as an antidote to fear. What plagues the Crane family, this ending seems to imply, is not supernatural. Rather, it is their own fear and thus refusal of love, whether that of romantic partners or of their own family. In contrast, Jackson's novel explores the way home, either as a physical structure or as a concept, can be an oppressive force, especially in women's lives. Eleanor comes to Hill House with a surplus of love to give after years of living without it. Her affection attaches itself to Theo, the doctor, and Luke in turn, but all seem to reject her offering. And she therefore transfers her adoration to the house itself. The more psychologically unhinged she becomes, the more she feels accepted by the house. "I am home," she thinks in one scene. She becomes convinced that Hill House wants her to stay, that it needs her, and her final action, though she questions her choice in her last seconds, is to ensure that she need never leave. Love and home are not cure-alls for Eleanor. As a social outsider who belongs nowhere and is loved by no one, these concepts are instead her undoing. There is no easy resolution to Jackson's story because the supernatural is a metaphor for the wickedness that lurks in human nature, our self-interest, our cruelty, and our need for conformity. In contrast, the show's rather facile message is that love cures seemingly all social ills, and that outsiders just need to be brought back into the family fold. Ultimately, though, the clearest indication of the showrunner's lack of understanding or lack of interest in Jackson's meaning is the fact that the series was renewed for a second season. But since the first iteration treated haunting as little more than unattended emotional baggage that can be neatly resolved by the season finale, the next set of episodes had to change locations. Season 2 is titled The Haunting of Bly Manor, and it is a very loose adaptation of Henry James' own classic ghost story, The Turn of the Screw. The compulsion to update a literary classic by fundamentally altering its core ideas does a disservice to these texts. A true classic becomes such because its themes have some kind of universality to which we can all respond, no matter how far removed from our own lives the setting may be. To be clear, I am not anti-adaptation. When thoughtfully and respectfully done, as with director Greta Gerwig's recent Glorious for cinematic retelling of Little Women, for example, I think adaptations have great value. First, they may send viewers back to the source text. Indeed, Jackson's archives at the Library of Congress, as you can see here, include folder after folder of letters like this one from haunted admirers, young and old, who came to her books through exposure to radio, television, and film versions. Rather, I lament the missed opportunity that inadequate adaptations represent. As evidenced by the recent revival of Jackson's work, the author's themes remain vital and relevant in the 21st century. A great adaptation could take advantage of that and update her fixations to shed light on their own contemporary fears, on our own contemporary fears. But rather than unsettle us anew, these adaptations seem to want to resolve the discomfort of the original text, to give us happy endings that we can leave behind and that we need never return to. Rather than condemning any attempted adaptation, my intention today is instead to argue that taking greater care with the original work will produce versions that can become just as vital and relevant to our own modern lives. The power of Jackson's writing means that her presence in our minds does not fade away once we have finished reading. Her ideas affect our perceptions of our own lives and thus persist in unsettling our view of the world. That should be the purpose of art, whether high art, low art, or anything in between. So here's hoping that someday we finally get the 21st century Shirley Jackson adaptation we deserve. Until then, may we instead keep going back to her books and stories, now her letters and biographies, in those moments when we need to see our world anew, to have our fears confirmed and explored, to appreciate the power of a good scare that does not lose its effect on the third, fourth, fifth, or even 10th reading. Thank you.